well, I'm a teacher now, I guess, but oh wow, okay. Sorry, I had to click I've got it, the meeting's being recorded. I almost clicked the leave meeting. That wouldn't have been good. So as we're logging in, and let's do a little unofficial start. So feel free to unmute or type in the chat box of David Horsager's 8 pillars. Which one resonated with you? And if you want to say why, just a couple of words, that would be really cool. And or unmute. And that would be cool too. So anybody have one that resonated with them? Clarity. Ooh. You could take the whole hour talking about that one, Jackie. Was there a particular hook in there that caught your eye, Jackie, on that clarity?
Yeah, I think it was well, they all resonated with me, so it was really hard to pick one. And I think that might be some of all of our struggles right now in the chat box. But with clarity, we keep talking about communication. We need better communication. We need to communicate more. We need to communicate. And we're communicating the heck out of the world. But what are we doing, right, that brings that clarity for everybody in the way that matters, in the moment that matters? And so that's really struck with me. How are we gaining clarity versus just communicating?
Thank you. And then Kristen and Erica both have compassion. And wow, we are in the helping profession. Yeah, we're educators, but we're also in the helping profession. And so that idea of approaching in the last, I just gave the opening to the Montgomery County Food Summit this morning. About 150 people logged in, and we talked about listening and storytelling and what would happen if we really listened to hear people before jumping into that content. And compassion is, and there's Josephine, another compassion, is one of the key elements of being able to do that well, I think. And so yeah, thank you. Trust. Hey, Debbie, Orange County, good to see you virtually. Man, I wish we were all in the same room. Let's see. Oh, I guess it's 9:01. So Jared, are you supposed to, not big on introductions, but wanted to do a little unofficial start as folks were logging in. None of that. Let's give it a few more minutes. It just kills me. But if you want to kick us off, let me stop sharing here.
Sure. Thanks, Brian. And that's a good kind of callback to our previous keynote from last year, right? Chad Littlefield, that unofficial start to engage those people and kind of reward those people who show up early. So I certainly appreciate seeing that ideal in action, which you always do. But good morning, everybody. I am Jared Morrison. I'm an organization development consultant with the Learning and Organizational Development Unit. And I welcome you in this morning to our ACEL 2 Extension series. This is the third installment of our third series. We've been doing this for 3 years now, which has been an amazing partnership with the Department of Agricultural Communication, Education, and Leadership. Myself and Beth Flynn work on coordinating everything, and then we're so grateful to have the ACEL faculty provide all of the content and the sessions for us. So it's been a great partnership that our director, Jackie Wilkins, who's here with us this morning, welcome in, Jackie, and also the chair of ACEL, Shannon Washburn, have been very supportive of, so we're appreciative of that too. We do have Brian Raison, one of our own from Community Development and Extension, with a dual appointment in the ACEL department to lead us today. As you saw, the content was up there already, but it is a discussion on on a book that will be our keynote speaker for annual conference, Trusted Leader, 8 Pillars That Drive Results. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Brian, and we'll just get rolling right in this morning. So thanks everyone for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. It's good to see you even virtually. And I'm just pleased and humbled to hang out with you guys for an hour and chat. So we started out, and yeah, thanks for mentioning Chad Littlefield. Again, I don't know him. I've met him a couple times, but I follow his approaches because he has some really good stuff for educators. And in my work and in our work, both in extension and my work on campus, I use his stuff all the time. And this was one, this unofficial start here. And we heard people, a few folks chimed in. So before we jump into the to the book discussion real quick, what strikes you about what we shared there during that unofficial start when you saw some of the pillars that were resonating with people, that opening question? Anybody want to unmute and tell me what strikes you? What did you notice as we were hearing from Jackie and reading some of the input? Different perspectives on what pillar was important and why. Absolutely, yeah, we saw several different ones. Anything else?
Hey, Brian, this is Kyle.
Hey.
Hi there. Hey, I wanted to share, in my career, I've read a million books on leadership, and a lot of them have different twists on kind of the same format. Back in the 50s, it was kind of like, and it's kind of like parenting too, back in the 50s, be tough on your kids, be demanding, and there's like a one size fits all. And as I was raising my kids, I kept buying all these different books because I'm like, oh, wait, that's not supposed to happen. And so I'm like trying to find the tab that says, what happens if they're jumping out the window to somebody's house, and, basically what I've learned, just seeing this too, is that I think that sometimes it's the emotional intelligence and living in a conscious reality of the world around you. What is going on? Do you feel like you're being successful? And maybe asking questions if people feel safe. My biggest concern is people not feeling safe to tell me what's really going on in a leadership role, because then I make decisions based on bad information.
Yeah.
So I don't even know if that, go ahead.
Oh yeah, and there were some examples of that in the book. So that's fantastic segues. Yeah, thank you, Kyle. That's, yeah, and one of the things that struck me was that there were also similarities that just popped into my head, that some people had the same pillar that really resonated. And so that was cool. So the differences, similarities, some specifics. Again, this is that reflective question. And we do this a lot of times when we're teaching. What struck you? What stands out? What's still circling in your mind? Some of those things that we ask when we're done teaching. So again, just kind of trying to demonstrate what we do every day and put that into practice. So let's jump in. And today I want to honor a retired colleague now, Dr. G. Such an amazing person. I took three classes with her, I think, and she had these classes where we would read a book in a week, come in and sit down for 3 hours and just rip it apart and have this 12-person class discussion. It was fascinating. So consider this a graduate class, and we're going to do just that. And I've got a couple of quotes that I have pulled out that I'll throw up on the screen, and then I'll stop sharing so that we can see each other, because I like that. And then let's just talk and see what we do. But before, let me just real quickly the couple of just quick definitions that I highlighted, some of the things that stuck out to me, and then we'll jump in. What do you think? Can these pillars drive results, as the title kind of boldly indicates? So let's go. So clarity, people trust that clear. They mistrust or distrust ambiguity. Compassion, people who, we put faith in people who care beyond themselves. And that's kind of easy to see a lot of times if people are other-centric or self-centric. Kyle, the EQ, the emotional intelligence, comes out, and you can see that people have that or they don't. But don't forget, you can learn emotional intelligence. And so you can study it. I love that idea. I've got a book on it. Character, we notice people who do what's right ahead of what's easy. The competency, fresh, relevant, capable, that's a big thing. Commitment, standing through adversity. I like a couple of examples, and thank you for some people of color to David, MLK, Gandhi, Jesus. He could have thrown a couple of women in there, it might have been nice, but we get the point. And so, God bless you, brother. Connection, we want to follow or buy from or be around friends, friendly people that we connect with. The contribution, getting those results. Yeah, because if you're not getting that, do we trust? Yeah. And then consistency, those little things that make the big differences over time that we can really depend on and rely. So I'll stop sharing in a second, but this is going to be our question for a couple of minutes. And I said, I've got several, and then I also want to invite you, I'll give you the pre-warning. If you have a quote or a question in a couple of slides, we will have you share a question, and then we'll kick that around again as a discussion group. So for our first question, can these pillars drive results as boldly indicated in the title? Unmute, type in the chat. What do you think? Because again, I'm not teaching today. This is just a book discussion.
This is Debbie.
Hey.
I truly think that all of those pillars, I actually wrote trust in there, and I don't know why I did that, but because I was just thinking about how that throughout the book, it was like, oh, do these people really trust me? Whatever. But I truly believe that all of the pillars do promote good leadership. And I remember when I very first started with Extension 28 years ago, over 28 years ago, that I remember Dave Snively told me I was going to go do something that was very, very hard. And I said, I can't do this. And he said, sure you can. He said, you need to remember that people need to know you care before they care what you know. And so I've kind of kept that as my mantra all through. And I think that it really does resonate that people, if they know that you care about them and care about what's happening and care about what you're doing, then they are more interested in learning about what you know.
Huge. Thank you, Dave Snively. I remember Davey. Others, and again, use the chat box or feel free to unmute. Will they really drive results?
I was reflecting on this, and just even the words results is always interesting. Like how are we defining results, right? And so a lot of times as an organization, we think about that in terms of the performance appraisal, for instance, or if people get promoted, and all of that's incredibly important. But I also have been thinking about as I've been reading through this, how do we drive results that are certainly metric oriented, but also are we choosing all of the right metrics for what results are we looking for? And for me personally with this book and thinking about what we're doing, it's that results that we've got leadership on every level with everyone contributing, and we have trust at every level with everyone contributing. And so I'm not quite sure how yet to measure that result, but it's one that I'm definitely, I think this book can contribute to.
Well, I want to say that I did not send my slides to Jackie in advance. But my next slide was going to be what she just said. Wait a second. Horsager's talking about driving results. What results do we seek? So let's modify our question with that nuance, and then let's think about some of the 8 pillars and the results that we want. So feel free, you can think for a second and then unmute or type again in the chat box and think about what results are we looking for in our work, because I think this is the critical hook to this book, which is a nice alliteration for you. What results do we seek? And then how do these pillars relate. So, and I like Nora's note there. Yeah, the pillar, they drive results, but trust is most important. And perhaps in our extension work, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, Nora. That's a huge component. So thoughts?
I work for a special, well, not special, minority group, Latinos, and if I don't get their trust, it's very difficult that they come to my classes. I teach nutrition, and what my results for what I think, my results are probably is not, numbers or statistics or things like that. But just, be able to make them feel like they have a place to get support and improve the quality of life that they are living as immigrants here in Columbus, Ohio. That's the sense of community that I tried to develop, and I was very surprised that during the pandemic we were able to do it also online. So that was something but the trust for me is the most important thing. You open the doors basically, then you have the other pillars, but the trust is what opens the door. Yeah.
Oh, Nora, thank you so much for sharing that, and particularly the context, the application of your work. That reminds me of our colleague who just retired, Susan Colbert, who was there in Franklin County, of course, and who could not love Susan. She had love for everybody, but she told many stories about starting in the neighborhood in Wineland Park, and what you just said, the exact thing, the need began with building trust because some of their audiences, some of the residences had seen Ohio State people before, and they came in and did research on them and then left. And so that, particularly with diverse groups, with minority groups, with low resource groups. So thank you so much for sharing that. Others, and then let's see in the chat as well. Consistency, Annie, yeah. And hopefully some of that will begin to level out as we go hybrid, as we have some in person. So Kristen, talking about understanding, and earlier I'd mentioned, so not everybody was on, I don't think, we were talking about storytelling and listening, and the power of listening before we jump in, and how strong that can be, and how that can really open doors and make connections. And so that understanding comes from listening. There's a great stories from the stage I've shared before, but maybe I'll pop it out after we're done here. Jared can share it with you guys about listening and recognizing potential in people. So, any other thoughts on this one about what Nora said, or anything in the chat there? These ideas of understanding, consistency, I really like those.
Brian,
the results that we're trying to get. Jared, yeah.
I was just going to add, Cheryl wrote in about when these pillars are put into practice, that they drive others to continue and do that, to kind of inspire other people. So I love that, and just wanted to call that piece out too. So thanks, Cheryl, for sharing that. But that idea of where we all help each other and encourage each other, and it builds if we are true to putting these into practice.
And that people feel valued. That she mentioned that as well. And that's a huge, you guys know this, we're, preaching to the choir proverbially. But talking about it, I think is helpful because I can get, go figure, if you know me, I can get focused on the content and on trying to deliver something and miss some of those other pieces that are so critical. So you guys are actually helping me. So thank you. So here's a quote. Whatever issues you're encountering, I can tell you one thing about those with complete confidence. At the core issue is trust. So a little challenge question on this one, not just what do you think, but can you think of an issue that would prove this point, that trust is the underlying problem? Or can you name an issue that we might experience in our extension work and disprove it, that it's not trust? How did you think it on this one?
Hey, Brian, Chris Brennis. I'm going to take an external example. Here earlier this summer, I had the opportunity to work with ODNR and their scenic rivers issue going on here in the county. And they had 2 public meetings, and 95% of the people that attended lacked trust of ODNR and what they were trying to accomplish. And I mean, it was real evident. Of course, it was real ugly. And I volunteered like a good extension educator to facilitate that meeting. And thank goodness I had some facilitation skills, right? And at the end of the day, we got the questions answered, and we kept a semblance of organization. But when people left there, they still didn't believe the answer. So, I mean, we really didn't accomplish anything because we didn't have trust.
As Elton John saying, I've seen that movie too, where you 30 years ago, I've got examples from industry and landfills, and I mean, yeah, I can go on. Other thoughts? Thank you, Chris. Yeah. Is trust, as Horsager says, the foundation?
Hi, Brian, Kyle again. And I would definitely say it is the foundation. And again, you read a lot of books on this, but just from life experience. And one thing that I would say that definitely proves it is I've tried to work through, I've used the 5 dysfunctions of a team. So, but like I said, these are all tangential. They're very similar and they're all great reads. But I've talked to staff about trust and how important that is. And I had conflict with someone and I said, you trust me? And they said, no. And I was glad that we could have an honest, frank conversation. That was not what I wanted to hear, obviously. And I said, why? And they said, I don't know. I'll have to think about it and get back to you. I hope they did. They never got back to me, but I hope they thought about it. Like I said, it's not what I wanted to hear. It's something I had to hear. We never did really get it resolved and talked about. But I mentioned it, and I've mentioned it at other meetings with where that person has been, and it's front of mind for me.
So can we crowdsource this just for a second? What would, let's say you're talking with Kyle over coffee and she tells you this story. What might you suggest to her for her next move to rebuild that trust or to regain that trust? What's an idea or two that you might share? It's a tough question, but she's your friend. You want to help her out. What advice would you give?
Okay, I'll bite. I've been really into reading about vulnerability and its importance within all of these pillars, and showing how, as leaders, we are under a lot of the same concerns, pressures, the things that we're thinking about these things too when we're communicating. So if it was someone had said that to me, my advice would be like, show how you are vulnerable to that person, and that may help them trust you.
Wow, have you been in my classes? So one of the things I teach are transparency, vulnerability, and in fact, this morning we talked about intellectual humility. And I told a group that I was talking with this morning in Montgomery County that I share with my students that, hey, guess what? Your professors don't know everything. They're people too. So I really like that. And then in the chat box, I saw have her ask the person from Renee. Oh, it's my sister. I'm not even reading who it is. Hi, Renee. Love you. Have her ask the person how she can make them feel more comfortable. That's a great, simple approach. And then Elena's note there too. I really like it's hard because it's a two-way street, and time is a necessary ingredient. Anytime we're doing this, it's absolutely a necessary ingredient.
May I share one more thing,
Oh,
Brian?
yeah.
For context, this particular person has a very different personality style than mine. So what I do now, because I am a very open, kind of transparent person, what you see is what you get. So when someone said they didn't trust me, it was like, wow, that's a slap in the face. I mean, they don't trust me, but I think it's because my personality, if you go through Gallup and you go through DISC, I mean, they probably thought, this isn't my world. I don't get this person at all. So what I do now is I just get right to the point when I talk to this person. I'm like, listen, did you have a good weekend? Listen, I know you don't like a lot of background talk and all that. So I'm going to get to the point. And I said, but if you want to talk, we'll chat. But and so I've had to do that because otherwise, I've asked about kids and people get offended. And so I'm like, okay, I'm walking this line. I don't know how much to share because they're like, get to the point, just the facts, ma'am type person. So, and that's, some of you guys know me, that's kind of not me. I'm like, hey, how's it going? What'd you do this weekend? And that's not what she wants to do. So I have to change my style to really connect with her.
Yeah. Thank you. Nice additional reflection, Kyle. I appreciate that. Man, there are like 4 topics we could take off on right now, and I'm just debating whether to do that. I want to hear from you all though. And I saw a couple of things in the chat box. Please multitask, read that, because there's some really good stuff in there. It's not a one style fits all. There's just lots. But let's jump to our next question real quick, and then after this one, I want to ask you all to share either a quote or an idea that you had. So there was a quote: "Trust is not a soft skill. It can be learned and practiced and be highly profitable, and not bottom line profit, but profitable for our work." So what do you think? What are soft skills, and is trust a soft skill or not? Other than what are soft skills, other than a term I hate, because research now shows that emotional intelligence, that these things, communication, teamwork, ability to communicate, all these things are absolutely not soft skills. They are critical skills for the 21st century worker or community builder or whatever, educator. So is trust a soft skill? And can it be learned? What do you guys think? What you're thinking on that? And you can pull in a pillar by all means that might exemplify your thought. Jackie's know there relates to this and soft skills, or I call them critical skills, that it's an ongoing, you can't just assume, you have to keep checking in. Yeah, it's a continuum. Jackie, you just unmuted.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I'm learning this month has been a powerful environmental and life opportunity to practice this. And so I think there's, I think for me, it's soft skill. I don't know what you want to call it, but for me, it's a continuous learning opportunity. And for me, that skills need honed and they need practiced. And what worked yesterday may not be what works tomorrow. And what may be, like I said, that checking account or that portfolio of trust where you feel like you've worked on that for a very long time may not be what matters in that moment in that day. And so we just have to keep sharpening that tool and keep on working at it. So I think it can be learned. I think we get better at it all the time. I think we fail in moments, and I think we learn from those moments and work towards
Had a
succeeding.
freeze up. Still there, Jackie?
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know who heard me, but I didn't know I froze. So
Jared? Oh, wait.
I think the freeze might have been on Brian's end. I heard Jackie okay. I think others were shaking their head that they did too. It may have been on Brian's end. So yeah, to build on that too, I'm actually going to post a link that's not really related to this book or specifically to this discussion, but this is a link that is in an activity that a small group of us were working on that Amanda Boland started based off of a different book that she read and was working with her staffs. But this link is a small clip where Simon Sinek, who is the Start With Why, that's what he's most known for, but he's talking about the idea of love, right? And we all have a pretty good understanding of love, but he kind of talks through like, there's not usually an instance where like love just doesn't exist and now it does. It's these little things that build up over time. And the way that he explained that, I think, just really highlighted that idea with things like trust and all these other emotional intelligence type skills, leadership skills, communication skills. They're little instances that continually build. There's no one thing you can do to just say, okay, I'm an expert all of a sudden. So yeah, that just was a nice thing that I think paralleled well with trust, the idea of trust too.
Thanks for sharing that, Jared. Apologies for jumping out. I don't know what happened. But that's a great corollary. So I want to quit at about 11:45 to give people just a breather and just step outside, take that time. I really appreciate what Jackie said yesterday in the director's update. That because today I'm kind of jumping from meeting till about 7 o'clock tonight because of students and whatever. But so I'm, I want to honor you guys and myself. But I want to have time to ask this question of you, and I prompted you a minute ago or at the beginning to think about this. I want your turn. Who has a quote or an idea from the book that they would like to share? I enjoyed the kind of the narrative style. It took me a little bit to get into it because I'm thinking, leadership book. And so I started reading and I was like, what is this guy doing? Trying to write a narrative nonfiction. But anyway, then I kind of, okay, I'll go with you. And then I was like, oh, wow, this is pretty interesting. So anyway, you have an idea or a quote that you would like to share or talk about and ask a question. In our book, again, this is a discussion, not a class. So we had about 15 minutes. We can go longer, but I just.
Hey, Brian. Can
Hey,
you hear
T.
me?
Yep.
This is T. Okay. So I've been talking about this in roadshows, but I think it's really worth saying again for those who have heard it before, forgive me. But on page 183, exactly, I think I'm pretty close. I think it's 183. And because we've been doing the keys work with extension, and Horsager talks about how defining your values and how those become behavioral yardsticks. And that's not a term that Disney used in their work with their keys and values, but that has really stuck with me. Um, behavioral yardstick, which means that we can measure it, which is also back to, that discussion about soft skills, and what we've talked about with the values is putting those I statements to them, and the behavioral statements that we can say this is how we're going to behave with each other, and that they're coachable, they're actionable, and they're observable, right? So that behavioral yardsticks is my thing from that book that I love.
I like that. Comments on T's sharing there. And it's kind of visual too. If you're old enough to remember what a yardstick is.
Exactly, Brian.
So thoughts on T's extraction there that she got. I love the idea. Comments. Oh, Deb. Well, first let's see if anybody wants to comment on T's note on the yardsticks, and then we'll jump to Debbie Carpenter because I like that too. Measuring ourselves, yeah. Keep an eye out. Yeah, we need to self-check a little bit. Yeah, Eric, you want to? Oh, go ahead, T.
Yeah, I love that Renee said that it's kind of a way to keep our an eye on ourselves. And I also think about it most days, it's kind of a way to keep an eye on myself. Right? How am I behaving today? How am I doing today? Often we get so caught up in other people's behaviors, right? And what they are not doing. And I'm like, I need to keep a check on myself. So I love that, Renee. I'm going to use that one.
Yeah, thanks. And Deb Carpenter, do you want to comment this idea of the mission statement that you saw from the book, your idea, something you can put on a plaque or napkin, but it's something you live every day. I really like that idea. I challenge a lot of audiences, my extension audiences, my on-campus audiences, to write a personal mission statement, and to not write a paragraph, but to boil it down to like 2 words. So thoughts on that from Deb or others about that focus.
I just know when I started reading it, I thought that it was I thought we have mission statements, but sometimes the only time that we really think about that mission statement is like when we read it on that, plaque or certificate that we have hanging up, or, whatever. But I like the idea that if you live it every day and do it every day, then it becomes your true mission instead of just your mission statement.
Yeah, extension is pretty missional in our work. Definitely good stuff there. Who else has an idea? Eric noted that culture of holding each other accountable. Certainly a few of the pillars would resonate there. Maybe we read more controversial books when I was we did not shut up for 3 hours. But it's different too online, and so I get that. So I'll be forgiving, no worries. Does anybody else have one they'd like to unmute and share? Just something that struck them in the book that's kind of lingering, and maybe it's something that isn't squared away, but it's something that's still circling in your head. It's kind of lingering, and you're wondering about. It's causing you to ponder.
Brian, the one that just kept striking, I think, again, the difficulty is there's so much good in this book. It's hard to pick certain things, but the one that I kept reading over is realizing that the problem is really a trust problem is sometimes the biggest hurdle, because I think it's hard for us to admit that something, because trust is such a personal thing, right? And when Kyle shared somebody and didn't trust her, then immediately you're like, how can somebody not see me as trustworthy when you work that way to build your life and to demonstrate who you are? And so it's easier to say, we've got a communication issue, or we have a competency issue, or we have a this or a that. And that's why I think it was hard to identify the issue earlier, because a lot of times the issue is trust. And then thinking about what is it about where trust is missed and how it plays out in these pillars and in specific issues is kind of the tricky part.
That's perhaps the heart of the whole idea, is that trust is so personal. And so we are sometimes really sensitive if somebody says, if we think somebody doesn't trust us, why wouldn't they trust me? And so that gets very personal.
But Brian,
Chris.
I think we also have to remember that, there's always multiple people involved here, and past history sets that bar for some people. And I had an employee that started that, like Kyle, did not want to talk about family, did not want to talk about, and as her supervisor, I asked her, why is that such a taboo, off limit topic? And she goes, well, I've been burned by that before. And that's all she would say. Now, 7-8 years later, I know all of her kids, I know all of her grandkids, and it takes time. But it's really interesting that we have to remember, as we bring a group of people together, we all have walked in different paths to get there. And we all have different experiences with authority. We all have different experiences with trust. And I think we have to allow ourselves time. And Jackie, when I hear you saying, how long have you been in that role now? You can't just say, well, I'm the director, people ought to trust me, right? And so, no matter what role we aspire to, trust doesn't come with the title.
Thanks, Chris. Absolutely. And it's that time. It takes time. Sometimes I think with some of the pillars from the book, we can maybe accelerate that or decrease the timeline and help trust to occur more quickly. We did that 29 years ago. I was in the private industry, paper industry, and we had a paper mill that we were going to close, 960 jobs, because we were losing about $1 million a month. And there was a huge distrust and disconnect in that organization between labor and management. And we brought a kind of a small team in and started trying to work with folks and see if we could get it turned around. And it took us about 1.5 years, but basically we did what I now preach is open the books. We went with full transparency and openness and said, we have to work together as a labor and a management group. We have to become one, or we're going to close the doors because corporate won't keep funding the loss. And we showed them the numbers. We showed the books. We got out on the floor. We started cleaning the place up, did a lot of things to build trust. And in 18 months, we got to a break-even point. We were able to save the mill. We actually sold it, but we were able to save those jobs. And it was thanks to people actually deploying some of these pillars because I recognize several places. I'm like, oh man, I've seen that. So don't judge other unit, you judge yourself. Oh, with other, yeah, using a different unit of measurement. Yeah. Ooh, that one's tough, man. Because to us, other thoughts. And again, we can go a little bit longer, but at 44 or 50, I wanted to give you the option of jumping out. Jane, action is what leads to results. Recognizing big priorities, that prioritization. So a lot of times I'll ask groups that I'm working with, my extension audiences. I did this a couple of days ago over in Chillicothe with a community action organization. I said, do you have a bucket list? This is the board of directors. And they're kind of looking at me, I'm like, this is going somewhere, but do you have a bucket list? And they gave me a few things. I said, well, you're thinking about dying, right? They're like, okay, because that bucket list is things we want to do before we die. And I said, that it sounds a little morbid, but it's really not. Because if we stop and think that we are immortal, then we can do just what Jane said. We can think about what's more important, and we can think about those priorities. And then we can quit doing some of the things that aren't as important and focus. And so we actually, Andy Stanley says, you actually give yourself more time when you think about, when you prioritize like that. When you think about your bucket list, when you think about your own mortality. Any last ones or thoughts on, I've got a couple more questions in my slides, but I'd rather hear from you guys in a true discussion format.
Brian, I was drawn to the pillar of connection, which, obviously we talk about relationships and connection a lot within extension. And I really particularly liked the piece, and it's on page 206, where he talks about magnetic versus repellent traits. And I'm also doing some emotional intelligence work, especially on that self-regard, self-expression, and kind of talking about the mood elevator and those types of things too. So I was kind of in my head, I think I'm pairing different lists of kind of moods or traits or behaviors. So I'm not, like you said, it doesn't have to be a fully thought out thought right now, but I just was drawn to connection and having those magnetic versus repellent traits and starting to think through, how do I work those magnetic traits more into my default, rather than potentially having any of the repellents be my default method.
And once again, you just hit on something that's really personal. And so I think maybe that's why these trust discussions in these books, and I agree, I think maybe it was Kyle said, you read Covey and Drucker and those guys back in the 80s and 70s, even back in the 50s. And you look at what they've said, and there's some really good wisdom, there's some ancient wisdom that's out there. But some of it can get really personal. And so that's where we have to be open and say, okay, look in the mirror, that was a Michael Jackson song. So we just went from the 50s to the 90s out. Any last thoughts, anything someone would like to share about this book, about a pillar, or about the discussion, any observation? Okay, we didn't lose too many people. We've still got 49 out of 55, I think. So, oh yeah, the feedback survey. Oh, thanks, Melissa. Yeah, chewing on it since July. And Jackie said she's starting to read it her third time. I'm like, oh my gosh. I like to read, and I reread books. but that's, I mean, there's some stuff in there, Jackie.
I was just going to say, I chose that as a book to read for this, and then I took it as a book to read for a leadership program that I'm in. And if anybody's on a plane anytime soon or on a long ride or whatever, don't take your other book that you're just hoping to get your arms wrapped around. Grab this one because it's a really good read. And every time I read it, and I read different parts of it, it's a different story each time, and something else really strikes you. And you know, it's good. Don't feel like you have to read it 3 times, but please just find a chapter that makes sense for you, or you know, read a couple pages at a time. It really will draw you in, and it has a lot to offer.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. And I'm going to give a shameless plug before you hang up. I sent a note out. It's sitting there on the shelf, The Warmth of Other Suns, Isabel Wilkerson. She's speaking on December 1st, I think it is. I sent the note yesterday or the day before in a webinar. And you talk about some personal reflection. It's very DEI related. It's about the story of America's Great Migration as Black America left the South and the Jim Crow South and came north. It's a fascinating read. And I almost missed it. It's the President and Provost Discovery Lecture Series. And so 5 o'clock on, I think, December 1st. So just that you talk about a book that I've read a couple of times. And it really helps me reflect and think about my audiences, about the work we're doing in our cities and in our rural communities across the state and nation in extension. And so thank you all. I'm glad to lead a discussion and to hear from you as best. It would have been much more fun in person, but this was good. And I heard some really cool things, so I appreciate it. Take 10 minutes, go outside, breathe, and enjoy the day. Jared, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, Brian, for your time. Again, putting this together and leading us through today. We certainly appreciate that. And to you all for being on and engaged today. As I mentioned, the survey is there. If you could please provide feedback and ideas for future sessions. And I'm also just now putting in the link to our landing page on January 20th. That'll be our next session, and it's dealing with difficult people. And Jeff King will be leading that session. So make sure to click on that link to check out those, the rest of the series coming up. We still have 5 sessions coming up after this.
I don't know any difficult people, do you? Oh, wait, where was that mirror?
Not internal, right? Yeah, but thank you all so much, and have a great rest of your weekend. Go Bucks.
Thanks, Jared. Thanks, Brian.
Hey, Jared, thanks.